So this next question, I'd really like to talk about. Now, you and I have had conversations about this, certainly offline, but I want to talk more about companies when they really don't respect regulatory quality and the importance of them having a seat at the table, kind of the real results of what that looks like. And I know we talked about warning letters, so over $1 million per company, 6 billion annually. I think part of the data around that too, every single year there's a company that loses 10% of its stock value due to warning letters as well. So it's painful every aspect of it. So can you share some more insight around your experience there? They do respect that and have a culture that is where quality and risk management are central to that.
Yeah, so I worked for a company, Kimberly-Clark. It was previously iFlow, and it was acquired by Kimberly-Clark at the time that I arrived. So my first week at Kimberly-Clark was the 6th week of an FDA inspection. Unbeknownst to me, I didn't know that they were going through an inspection at the time that I was hired. So I showed up and found out that they were going through this big inspection on their primary product was infusion pumps or pain pumps. And so, yeah, they got a long 483, had 10 findings on it. And then the state tacked on 2 more to that 10. So they had 12. And I spent a whole year responding to the 10 monthly to the FDA. And then to the state, I had to respond to them quarterly. And what they did to help resolve that, they brought in outside counsel to help respond to the questions and put together a regulatory plan on how they were going to manage all of those findings and how they were going to resolve them. They also hired multiple contractors to fix the problems. And they had to prepare the response, and we did mock FDA inspections. So we would have somebody come in randomly, probably like every quarter or so, and they would, announce it over the loudspeaker, like the code word was like peanut butter or something like that. I forgot what it was. And we all knew, oh no, the FDA is here. And we didn't really know if it was the real FDA or if it was the fake FDA. So we had to pretend and act like it was the real FDA and go through the whole thing. And then the FDA finally did return after a little over a year. And we had done so well in preparing for it that we wiped out all of our 483s, all of our findings with both the state and with the FDA. And we closed out a warning letter that was from a few years prior to that in 2008. And so it was a happy ending in the end, but it was very costly getting to that point and all the money that went into that.
And think about how many people were probably traumatized after that, would never be able to eat peanut butter again.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, but you know what? It was a great learning experience, and I've taken that to every company that I've gone to since. And really saying we need to have a culture of compliance. We need to make sure that we, are doing everything the right way, because when it goes wrong, it goes wrong. So another example that I can tell you about is I worked for a company where I knew like 2 weeks going in that it was not a good company and that they really did not have a culture of compliance and quality was not their number one priority. Mm-hmm. And they wanted me to sign off on documents that I didn't feel comfortable signing off, that were not, that it was like there was a verification and validation document that needed to be signed, and there was a design control, and that's like R&D's activity. It says in the FDA regulations, the person that's responsible for those activities is the one that signs off on these documents, and they wanted me in regulatory affairs to sign off on them. And I didn't feel comfortable. And I told the person that was the VP at the time, so a couple levels up, he said, you need to sign off on these documents. I said, I'm not going to sign them. And he then grilled me for about an hour and a half why I need to sign them. And I said, I'm not signing them. I said, look, I said, my R&D won't sign them. Quality won't sign them. My own manager won't sign them. Why should I sign them? And he said, fine, I'll sign them. And he signed off on I said, great, we're good. And then he pulled me and my manager into his office and grilled us for like another hour and a half, how we needed to get trained and we needed to sign them in the future. And I said, I'm not signing them. And I left. I found another position within like a few months later and left the company. But I got a call 2 years later from the FDA saying, hi, this is and at my company, so they knew where I worked. They called my work phone number and said, this is Inspector so-and-so. I'm doing a criminal investigation on this company that you worked at, and I have some questions for you. I said, okay, like, what do you want to know? I mean, I didn't do anything wrong, and thank God I didn't, because I wasn't the subject of their investigation, but they did a round of asking a lot, interviewing a lot of people that worked there previously. And then they went back, they gathered all their information. A year later, they went back and they had a big FDA inspection.
Well, it's kind of like going and asking the quality manager or the team of the design history file that's putting the inputs, outputs, and putting that whole document together to sign the 510K submission. It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
No. So. Yeah. And if R&D, who's responsible for design control and verification and validation, if they don't feel comfortable signing those declarations, why should I sign? I mean, why would I want to sign them? I mean, they're responsible for those activities. They should sign them.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of smoke there. Obviously there ended up being fire as well. So when you talked about the Kimberly-Clark, and I don't know if you could speak to this. So I was having a conversation actually this week with a VP of RAQA and kind of somewhat of a similar background. Like, he's got a lot of experience in both sides. And we were talking about warning letters. He'd been involved in clearing 483s and dealing with quite a few scenarios around 483s and warning letters. And he said that because companies and sometimes executives don't understand how important the initial response is on the 483, they have a tendency to not put the resources behind it that they should, because they could fix it more on the 483, and it leads to a warning letter and it ends up being 10, 20 times more expensive. So I just kind of, I don't know if you could speak to that specifically relevant to that Kimberly-Clark example or other experiences in general, your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes I know that there was a situation at a company that I worked at where I came into the company and they had a 483 in another country at another site. And they responded to it, but then there were more questions. I don't know the details of it, but somehow they didn't get back to the FDA and they didn't give them all the information that they were supposed to give, maybe a follow-up. And what resulted was they got a warning letter because they didn't address it properly. If you don't address it properly, I mean, yeah, they know you're not taking it seriously, and it will turn to a warning letter.
Well, I was just explaining to somebody that didn't, somebody younger that didn't file their taxes the year before. They were doing jobs that were, part-time school type thing. And I was like, you get in a lot more trouble just by not.
Yeah.
Come back later. So there's some consistency there in that regard relevant to the government.
Yeah. Just because you ignore it doesn't mean it goes away, right?
That'd be amazing.
What it is.
That's a life lesson that helps in all aspects of life.
Yeah.
So in terms of hiring talent, I'd love to get your thought, and I'll throw something out that I'd love to get your perspective on. Because in the decade that I've been doing this, I've seen so many companies miss out on talent because they're not open to crossover talent. They just kind of miss the forest for the trees sometime. And I think with your career, I mean, you'd never done IBD before you did IBD. You picked all of your stops based on the opportunity, the culture. It wasn't product driven, even though you have this really unique bandwidth of experience. So I'm going to ask you kind of two questions here, but I want to get your take on how you look at cultural fit, crossover skills, and bringing somebody into the team. And then I'll just kind of give you an example. I think I've only helped two people that didn't have regulatory experience that were in quality move into regulatory. Typically, if you don't have any regulatory, from my experience, the leadership won't even consider that person. Yeah. So that was pretty unique. I knew the leader, I knew what they wanted, and they trusted me. And then I brought somebody who'd always wanted to get into regulatory, never gotten an opportunity to work well in one of those situations. But it's like the 510K process, US pathway versus international. And in international, Russia, China, Japan, for example, it's different in each country. And sort of understanding the culture, reading the tea leaves, the due diligence that they have to do sometimes around things. And I've said this to VPs before, I've asked people their perspective, but I just think it's really interesting that from my experience, typically for a regulatory position, they won't consider anybody for the US side if they don't have 510K submission experience of some sort, having led or PMA supplements, de novo, et cetera. And I think that companies miss out on talent that already fits the culture, and that the complexity of the international, like they could learn, they could come over, and from my experience, they typically won't even consider that. But I'd love your thoughts on those two.
Yeah, I've you know, in the past, I've interviewed with companies that said, if you don't have this product experience, then we're not interested. And the way I've always looked at it, and like you said, like I never knew IVD before I worked for IVD. I never knew dental before I worked in dental. I never knew pain pumps before I worked in pain pumps. I mean, product knowledge to me is a nice to have. Mm-hmm. You know, it's with great product training within a company, you can learn about the product. You can, you know, do a lot of research. You can have somebody within each of the, you know, somebody from R&D or, you know, the product manager train you on that product and show you how it works. As far as like 510K versus PMA, if somebody has 510K experience, I feel like they could write a PMA. If they have PMA experience, I feel like they could write a 510K. I mean, they have the technical knowledge to be able to do it. It's being a good writer. And you know, it's as far as what I'm looking for, it's like I'd rather take somebody that has some experience or some knowledge, but has a good attitude, mm-hmm. versus somebody that has a crappy attitude and has a wealth of information, because you can't teach a good attitude, you know. So yeah. I think you know, a good attitude fits into my work culture a lot better than, you know, somebody who just doesn't have a good attitude. And it's kind of, you know, maybe like I struggle with somebody that has like a really negative attitude, like, oh, you know, everything's terrible. You know, I want to hear like, give me some, you know, like some solutions or what we could do or how we're going to make it better, or a can-do attitude. That goes a long way for me. Mm-hmm.
And from a neuroscience standpoint, it's interesting because data shows that when we have a positive attitude, we're 30% more likely to problem solve, to find solutions. And so if you have somebody that's got a negative attitude, then they're less likely to see other people's perspective. And what are your thoughts on when there are people that are working on international roles where they're doing a lot of taking CERs, tech files, design dossiers, and they're compiling them from the US team and then disseminating them? Do you think there's opportunity there to maybe evaluate writing skills and look at different things, that there might be opportunities for them from a crossover thing? Or do you think that's just too much of a divide?
Well, I mean, there's different ways. When you talk about international registrations, there's different ways that I've done them, where I've had a lot of times I work with like a third party company or with an in-country, like a company like Kimberly-Clark. They have people in certain countries. Right. So usually we're feeding the documents to them, and then they compile it and write up the different sections for the international registrations. Very rarely have I had that done internally within my department, writing up an unless it's like Canada registration. We've done that, where we've compiled, and that's more like writing a 510K, writing an application for Canada. It's very similar. If you can write a 510K, you can write an application to Canada. For Australia, TGA, same thing. I mean, you can write it up. We're putting together a technical file, really.
That's very interesting. I've heard that multiple times, and but again, historically, typically not if the part of the responsibility is 510K authorship.
Yeah.
I always ask, okay, do they have to have their name on it? Because there's plenty of scenarios where people have led the 510K process. They've written certain sections of it, not all of it, but their manager signed the 510K, even though they really involved in most of the work. And so I think people appreciate that differentiation. But typically, if they haven't worked on a 510K, even if they've worked on Canada or others, they're typically not. It's not an option to be in the conversation.
Yeah, and I know here, like my RA manager where I'm at now, she likes to bring in people that have that. Because I mean, I know big companies, sometimes they'll only do a section of the 510K. Each person's kind of assigned a section, and they don't get to put together a whole application. Then they give it to the person who's going to compile all the sections, and then they submit it under your name, like you said. In companies that I've worked at, I always try to give each person the opportunity to write the whole 510K themselves. And so I put them on a project and they write it from beginning to end. And so they get the full experience, and then they submit it under their name. And I want them to get credit, because I know that there are some people who say, well, I don't see your name on any of these 510Ks. How do I know you really wrote it? And that's really a disservice to that person who spent all that time. We do look for people that have that full experience, but if they don't, it just means we're not going to hire them as like a principal regulatory affairs specialist. If they've never written in a 510K, we'll hire them more as an RA specialist until they get that experience, and then they'll get promoted up. And you talked about being a quality person and then getting into regulatory. I think that it depends on what level you're at. If you're like a quality manager and then try to move into regulatory, that's going to be hard. You're not going to get into a regulatory manager position. So you're willing to take a step down, and that's hard to do sometimes.
Well, and that situation was really unique, and I had several conversations before we even moved into the process, because I was like, you're going to take a pay cut. You've wanted to do this for 4 years. Do you really? And this was a senior level quality person.
Yeah.
This was maybe 4 years ago. So I think that person, it's only happened twice, but that person had probably 6 to 8 years of experience, took about a 10K pay cut, and ended up going into a regulatory affairs, either specialist or associate title, about a 10K. But they got to do, and now they've been in regulatory for 4 years, and they're making more money than they made before, because they've done. So it took a step back to move forward in an area that they really always wanted to do. So I know, it's hard to do that. One, I don't think I've ever asked anybody this question, but okay, how about the person that has reviewed 35 10Ks? Like, they're the person that somebody's putting them together, and they're reviewing them and making sure everything's where it's supposed to be before it moves forward. But they typically don't get opportunities to move into the other side. It's not looked at the same way. What are your perspectives?
I guess it's, you can always try to get like some kind of, some people are good at writing and some people aren't. So you maybe want to get a writing sample, maybe they can provide.
Like, instead of just saying no, okay, well, let's have some conversation around that and give you some examples.
Yeah. We recently hired somebody who was very green right out of college, not even finished with college. And she's taking a course that's a regulatory degree course. And we asked her, gave her like a scenario, like, what would you do in this situation? What would be the regulatory pathway? And she didn't know how to answer it. She didn't even know what the guidance document was for deciding when to submit a 510K. It's like, well, what are you learning in school? So, I told the manager, I said, you know what? I said, come up with 3 scenarios, give her the guidance document, send her away. Hopefully she's not having somebody do it for her. And I said, and see what she comes up with, and have her write a response and put together like what, how she would determine the regulatory pathway. And I go, then you can see her thought process. And she came back, she answered all 3 questions. Before we even sent it to her, she emailed back and she said, oh, I know I need to use this guidance document. We didn't tell her what the guidance document was. So she figured it out.
A little bit nervous.
Yeah. So she came back, she answered the first 2 perfectly. And the third one, she came to the wrong conclusion, but we could see her thought process. And I said, well, she can do it, like, let's give her a chance. So, I mean, we hired her as an RA specialist, and we'll see how she does.
Root for her. Okay.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, and it's the conversation. I think I've had conversations with executives, C-suite or VPs, at least 6 times in the last month alone, where they're like, you know what, you can teach certain skills, but you can't teach culture. You can't teach attitude. You can't.
Yeah.
It's just important. I want to get into, you and I have had different discussions around board roles, which I found to be very interesting. And then I just thought there'd be a lot of value of us talking about this here. And I know, like, for me, I've been almost 2 years now on the board of Quality Means Business, which was the first board role I've ever had where there was compensation around it. I volunteered for 3 years for a charitable board because I care about charity, and then I wanted to learn about boards. But you took a course recently, and I'd love for you to share some of your insight and what you learned around that, and then I'll follow up with some things around mission, vision, and values.
Yeah, so I took a course. It was a 12-week course to become board certified, and really I didn't know going into it what the duties or what the requirements were for a board member and exactly what they did. I just knew, like, that's something I wanted to learn about and I wanted to get into. I learned a lot. I felt like I learned a lot about what it is and through the course. And, I was surprised to see that I had a lot of qualities that I learned throughout my career that were very applicable to being a board member. I didn't realize that I had those qualities,
Awesome.
just in what I've learned, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but just in compliance and risk and governance and strategy, I mean, those are all qualities and experiences that I've learned. So,
So I know one of the things we talked about was just mission, vision, and values.
Yeah.
So it's such an important topic. And when you look at companies, 40% of startups don't make it 2 years, and the 5 years, and then 80% of companies don't make it 10 years. But when I first started my company, it was like, okay, like, what's your mission? I was like, what are you talking? Like, my first 2 years was just like, stay alive. To stay in business, and I don't throw away. I didn't light my entire retirement on fire to try to start this company.
Yeah.
And then it was like, okay, wait. And then I was like, no, you really, I can, our mission is to help people with relevant career advancement opportunities while helping build companies that bring positive products to our families, to patients, and then support the charities that I care about, have passion for. I think the mission and the vision should be a part of every aspect of the interview process. It should be lived. Just like we talked about, whether it's design history file or it can't be just a document that goes away once. You have to live it. And so, and you shared a little bit about aspects of that and what you kind of learned through. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah. So I learned that it's kind of like a pyramid: values, then vision, then mission. And like you said, every company should have that. So values is like, what do we stand for? They're the guiding principles for decision making and action. Vision is like, where are we going? Where do we aspire to be? And it describes the future aspirations. Mission is, what do we do? Who are we doing it for? And like, what's the organization's purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And that now needs to be like, when you're going to a board, or when a board's, you're a nominee for a board. From what I've learned is that, like, they'll have a pitch book, and that should be part of the pitch book. Values should always be on, like, the top priority. They're created by the board. The values, vision, and mission are created by the board, and they should be then cascaded down to the CEO, down to the VPs, to the directors, and below. And it should be the forefront of what their company is.
So that's one thing you'd say interesting. I'm not sure. Like, the board should create those, because
Yes.
my perspective, and I didn't have a board at first, but that the company executive team is responsible for creating those values and first, and that, excuse me, and then I think the interview process, delineation of the functional skill, the technical skill in any functional area versus the cultural fit is very important. I've seen so many companies put those together, and they don't really do a good job of evaluating that. But the cultural questions, what I share with the companies I partner with, or if I'm helping them customize the interview process, is that those values determine cultural questions, and there should be 4 to 6 of those that are peppered throughout the interview process by different people. They're asked a different way, but they're all come from the values of the company. And if you have a company of cutthroat lawyers versus charitable foundation, those values and the way you ask those questions are going to be completely different. But you have to differentiate between the technical skill and the culture. You're really not going to know, which affects the cost of mishires and annual voluntary turnover, and all that factors in there.
Yeah. And I mean, if a company doesn't have a board, then of course, like, that's going to come, like you said, from the executive team. And when they're forming a board, the board members need to make sure that their values align with the company's values. That's very important.
Yeah, and I think from a standpoint of being in the startup world this last 6 years, I mean, every single one of those companies, they've already got a board first. So it would make sense from that standpoint, in that world versus small business owners. That makes sense. So on boards, and they tend to have medical experts, CEO, operational experts, reimbursement, commercial. I always see those on these different boards. Not always the RAQA expert on board right off bat. What, in consideration of that and the value and experience that that person brings to a board seat, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
So I think a regulatory and quality expert would be a huge asset to any company. I mean, these are the people that are experts in compliance, risk, strategy, like we talked about, and governance. And that's applicable to any company, any industry. Compliance, it's multiple departments. It's in every industry. It affects HR, facilities, finance. There's compliance in every area. Like for human resources, there's discrimination and equal opportunity. There's labor standards. There's benefits and compensation. For facilities, there's like legal and regulatory compliance. There's safety compliance. There's environmental compliance, security. And then when you get to financial, there's like the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's the Electronic Fund Transfer Act. There's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's consumer leasing. There's, it goes on and on. So there's compliance in everything, but also in every industry. There's automotive has its own compliance. There's toys, restaurants, aerospace. Every company has their own compliance. And then there's risk. So RAQA, we're all about taking a risk-based approach and how we apply that to a business. Like I said, I like to give 3 solutions, each with their own level of risk. And based on that, we make a business decision. Then there's strategy. So strategy focuses on optimizing value for stakeholders and enhancing governance effectiveness to identify and capitalizing on market opportunities and developing strategic plans. I mean, regulatory affairs, we put together regulatory strategies all the time with the help of the marketing department, putting their input into our strategy, and we determine the regulatory pathway to bring the product to market. And then the final thing is governance. We're establishing and reviewing policies, setting strategic direction, overseeing management, ensuring compliance, and managing risk. That's what governance is about, and that's what I do with my department.
And I need to correct what I said, the way I said it. After I said it, I was like, oh, okay, I didn't say that very well. But not that companies are not. I think, I go to LSI, LSX, like most. Every company has a board member around regulatory quality or compliance. But I think it, depends on where they're at. And some companies start out with 3 board members initially and then go to 5
Yeah.
So I was asking more, I guess, the question around the importance around it, not whether companies have it or not. They do have it. So I don't think I really said that correctly. So I'm going to correct that point. But no, I think that's really well said. Well, I really appreciate you joining me. It's been a great conversation, your expertise and experience with our following.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoy our conversations all the time. So
I appreciate that.